This is a story I created for a leaving do of a well-regarded colleague at the University of Winchester when I worked there. And you have to imagine, as I'm telling this story, to other lovely colleagues doing a shadow puppet performance of it at the same time. So this is the story of the Princess of the Great Heart, and this is how I will tell it to you. Long ago, in a kingdom not so far from where you live, there was a princess, and the princess was the luckiest princess in the world because she was surrounded by love. Not only the love of her mother and her father, the king and the queen, but the love of everyone who met her. And because of this love, she grew up to be known as a princess of the great heart, because she was full of love for everyone who met her in the same way that they loved her. When she was a young child, early in the morning, she would go down to the stables and she would sit and watch the groom brushing the horses and listen to his stories of the horses, of their adventures, of their lives. And as she grew up and grew old enough, she helped him brush down the horses, and she asked him questions about his stories, and she talked to him, but it never occurred to her to treat him as anything lower than herself. After spending time with the groom, she would then go into the kitchen and as a young child sit and watch the cook and occasionally be given a bit of pastry to play with. And she'd listen to the cook's stories of life below stairs. And as she got older, she started to help the cook, and she'd often have her hands deep in pastry with flour up to the elbows, asking the cook questions about the stories that she told, but never occurring to her that she should talk to the cook as anyone lower than herself. In the evening, she would sit and sew with her mother. And as she sewed with her mother, she would listen to the stories of their family. And the only person I haven't mentioned is the king. Well, the king told her stories of the kingdom, of their history. And as he was doing this, he would be plaiting her hair and brushing it and making it beautiful and tying ribbons into it. She grew up, and the inevitable happened. A prince from a neighbouring kingdom coincidentally found himself in the vicinity more than once. He seemed to be quite a regular visitor. He would be seen walking in the gardens with the princess, with the two of them with their heads close together, or sitting on a bench whispering to each other and occasionally laughing. And so the wedding day was announced. And everyone in the kingdom was excited, everyone was happy, and everyone was ready to have their heart broken because they were losing their princess of the great heart. On the day of the wedding, before the princess had to get ready in all her bridal finery, she went down to the stables to speak to the groom. And she sat and talked to him while he brushed the horses and prepared them to pull the great coach that she would leave with her new husband in. And as he was talking, she saw a tear rolling down his cheek. And she said, "Why are you crying? This is a happy day." And he said, "I'm crying because I fear that you will forget us. Please, Your Highness, is there something that you have on you now that you could give me so that I could remember you by and always remember this day?" And the princess of the great heart thought the best thing that she could give him would be part of her heart. So she reached into her chest and plucked part of her heart and gave it to the groom, who looked at it and took a handkerchief from his pocket and placed the heart in the handkerchief and wrapped the handkerchief around it and then put the handkerchief in his own pocket next to his own heart. And then the princess went to the kitchens where all was busyness. There was a wedding feast to prepare for, but still the cook had time to talk to her. And as the cook was talking, stirring while she talked, a tear rolled down her cheek. And the princess said, "Why are you crying?" And the cook said, "Because I'm sorry that you are leaving and I fear you will forget us. And is there something that you could give me? Something that you have on you now, that I could remember this day forever." And so the princess of the great heart reached into her chest and plucked another piece of her heart and handed it to the cook, who took it and put it into a locket that hung around her neck. The wedding service was over, and it was time for the banquet. And the prince and princess sat at the high table with the king and the queen, and the king sat next to his daughter and put his hand over her hand and said, "My daughter, I never want to forget this moment. Is there something that you can give me that I can hold on to and remember this time for the rest of my life?" And the princess of the great heart did what she inevitably would do, and she plucked another piece of her heart and gave it to her father, who put it in a silk bag that he hung around his neck and tucked it inside his shirt. At the end of the banquet, it was the time for the prince and the princess to leave to go to their new home. And they walked down the palace steps and they climbed into the carriage, the prince taking the princess's hand so that she could be helped into the carriage. And then the princess pulled down the window to kiss her mother goodbye, and her mother held onto her hand and said, "My child, I never want to forget this moment, and please never forget us." And her daughter said, "You will never forget this moment. And here to remind you." She plucked the last piece of her heart from her chest and handed it to her mother. And her mother pressed the piece of heart in her hands. And as she watched her daughter and her daughter's new husband ride away, she took the piece of heart and placed it between the layers of her clothing. And thereafter she would do that every day, so that the piece of her daughter's heart was always carried with her. A week after the wedding, the king and queen were having breakfast. A letter arrived that it was given to the queen because habitually she was the one who read post first thing in the morning. The king could never be bothered. The queen read, and as she read, her face went ashen. The king looked up and realized there was something wrong, and the queen, with trembling fingers, handed the letter to her husband. Her husband took the letter and forgot his boiled egg as he read from the prince that the prince had fallen in love with the princess of the great heart, that their marriage day had been the greatest day of his life. But when he and his new bride arrived in their new home, the princess that stepped out of the carriage seemed a different woman. She seemed more of a shell than a woman. She seemed to have no heart left in her, and he feared for her. He feared for her life. The king put down the letter and felt the bag under his shirt. He lifted it out and said, "My wife, I have a confession. On the day of our daughter's marriage, I asked her for something that I would always remember her by, and she gave me this," and he tipped out the piece of her heart. The queen looked, and she looked at her husband, and she nodded, and she said, "I understand. For when she stepped into the carriage, I asked her for something to remember her by, and reaching into her clothing between the layers, she found the fragment of her daughter's heart and held it out to her husband, and she gave me this." The two of them looked at the pieces of heart. There was not enough here for a whole heart, and so they tried to work out where the rest of it must be. They went back to the wedding day the week before and tried to piece together the events of the day. They went down to the stables. The groom bowed low. He was not used to receiving the king and queen in the stables. And the king said, "On our daughter's wedding day 1 week ago, did she give you anything to remember her by?" And the groom, who thought he was in trouble, reached into his pocket and took out the handkerchief and unwrapped it. And the king and the queen said, "Thank you." Then they went to the kitchen. The cook curtsied low. She's not used to seeing the king and the queen in the kitchens. And the queen said, "A week ago our daughter was married. Did she give you anything to remember her by?" And the cook, who thought she was in trouble, opened the locket, and there was the fragment of heart. And the king and the queen took the pieces of the heart back to their chambers, and they saw that it was whole. And so they took the pieces of the princess's heart and placed them in a lined casket and sent them to her. Over the next week, the kingdom was sad. It was as if its own heart had been ripped from it, that they had nothing to remember the princess by. But at the end of that week, a package of letters arrived and were placed before the Queen at breakfast. She opened them and found 4 letters, one for her, one for her husband, one for the groom, and one for the cook. She handed her husband his letter, and the 2 of them opened their letters at the same time. And what they read was a letter of thanks from their daughter, that now she had her heart back where it should be. She was who she should be. She was who she should be, both for her husband and for herself, and also, of course, for her new kingdom. But she went on to say that she didn't want her mother and her father and her kingdom to forget her. And then in the Queen's letter was a story about family life, about her life with her mother and her father in the palace. In the king's letter, there was the same gratitude, and then there was a story of the history of the kingdom, of his place in it with her, the princess of the great heart. And when they had read their letters and embraced, the king and the queen went down to the kitchen and gave the cook her letter, and when she opened it, she found gratitude for the return of the fragment of heart. And there was a story of life below stairs as the princess had experienced it. And then they went to the stables and handed the groom his letter, and then they realized that he couldn't read, so the king read the letter to him. The same gratitude and a story of a princess growing up, enjoying being in the stables with the groom and of learning about the horses. And every week a package arrived. And every week there was a new story for the groom, for the cook, for the king and the queen. And the kingdom could live again and gain its own heart. For the princess with the great heart had given them her stories to remember her by. And that is the story of the princess of the great heart. And that's how I have told it to you.